For coming. My name's Shannon Smith, and I'm the coordinator for the Nebraska Invasive Species Council. And welcome to our first ever Nebraska Invasive Species Awareness Week. So this week runs this year from May 26th through May 30th. And we are kicking off the week with some different events to raise awareness about invasive species issues in Nebraska starting today. And we will conclude our event with an in-person event at Pawnee State Recreation Area on Saturday, which is in Lincoln, and that'll be from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. So if you're in the area, we hope you can join us. But for the week, we're going to have webinars every day, 1 to 2 p.m. Central. And we're starting with Chris Helzer from the Nature Conservancy. And Chris is also a member of our Nebraska Invasive Species Council. Chris, how long have you been on the council?
Since whenever it started, I don't remember.
Okay, so 2012, so a longtime member. So I'm going to read a little bio about Chris, and then Chris, if you want to add anything, you are totally welcome to. So Chris Helzer is the Nebraska Director of Science and Stewardship for the Nature Conservancy. He conducts research on grasslands, helps develop and test land management strategies, supervises the stewardship of the Conservancy's staffed preserves in Nebraska, and spends lots of time blathering on about how beautiful and valuable prairies are. Chris started his career as a land manager for the Conservancy 28 years ago and still regrets giving up that job. And he also runs an amazing blog called The Prairie Ecologist and has a great Instagram page for that as well. Chris, did you want to add anything about yourself or does that cover it?
That sounds great.
And then I'll also let our other panelists introduce herself as well.
So I'm Jenna Poggles. I am with Nebraska Game and Parks Aquatic Invasive Species Program. I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Program biologist. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. And like Shannon said, we're really excited to be able to host these webinars throughout the week and then conclude the event on Saturday. So I hope you guys can make it to that as well.
And we are recording this, so this will be available on the Nebraska Game and Parks YouTube page, and we'll have a link available some other places as well. We're going to have questions at the end. So if you have a question during the presentation, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you should have a black bar and there's a button that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to your right that has a box with a question mark that says Q&A. So you can type your questions in there and we will be sure to answer them at the end. So Chris, I will let you get started if you're ready.
I'm ready.
All right.
Okay. Well, hi everybody. Yeah, thanks for joining. I'm going to talk today about invasive species a little bit, but I'm also going to talk about the things that are not invasive species and why it's really important to know the difference. So I want to start by listing a few of the things that are truly invasive plants in Nebraska. And I'm focusing on plants mostly today, but a lot of this applies to some other species as well. But things like leafy spurge or Siberian elm, Sericea lespedeza, there's a whole list here. These are true invasive species that will invade an area, they'll spread even when there's a pretty strong competition from neighboring plants and there's a pretty good plant community, which makes them problematic. And they also have, damaging impacts on livestock management or ecology or both. And a lot of times they can not only invade an area, but they can actually change the conditions to favor themselves. So these are some invasive species. We're going to circle back to these at the end. But I want to start by talking a little bit about how plant communities work and how competition works, because this is going to really help, I think, when we get into the main topic. So very briefly, when you have a plant community that's in good shape, there's plants that are growing above ground and below ground at the same time, right? And they are using pretty much what's available in terms of the resources, the sunlight, the moisture, the nutrients in the soil, which means there's not a lot of space for new plants to come into that plant community because everything is already taken up in terms of resources. And you can graze a site or hay a site or mow it. And as long as you mow it relatively high or graze it fairly high, it doesn't really change that competition much. Those dominant plants are still going to be using up the majority of those resources, and there still is not a lot of new space for new plants. However, if you do a little bit more, if you graze a site, for example, down to the ground, and especially if you do that for a sustained period of time, a month or 2 months or a full season or something, that starts to have a big impact on those plants' ability to compete. And this works with grasses in this picture, but it also works with the wildflowers and other species. And what happens is they lose root mass, they lose the ability to pull resources from as much of the soil because they can't support the same kind of root material. They also, because they're shorter, there's more light that hits the ground. So you have more light, more moisture, and more nutrients available, which allows other plants to have a chance to sort of enter that community. And a lot of times those are short-lived plants, but there are long-lived plants that also reproduce this way, where they wait for an opportunity to engage and to reproduce and to spread a little bit, because they normally have a hard time doing that when the community is sort of saturated with competition. So these short-lived, long-lived plants, the ones that are taking advantage of this opportunity, are the ones that I really want to talk a little bit about today. And so this is an example of what that can look like, right? So this is a site, this is actually my family prairie, which in the year that this was taken, this particular pasture was full of Western ragweed. There's a bunch of other stuff in there too, but Western ragweed is the dominant plant in this photo. And that's a great example of an opportunistic plant. Here's another example of these plants that are taking advantage of a site that was grazed for an entire season. This is along the Central Platte River. This is some Nature Conservancy land that I work with. The site was grazed really hard the previous year, really knocked back the dominant grasses. And the response in this case was all of these wildflowers. So when that happens, as the disturbance, the impact goes away. So if you move the grazers off, or this, and this can apply to things like a flood event or a sustained drought, can also have a lot of the same impacts where you sort of suppress that dominant plant community. As that changes and the grasses, the dominant vegetation starts to recover, some of those plants that inserted themselves into the community will fade away because they can't handle that competition. Some of them will hang around, but they'll sort of be much reduced in size, and they might just put up a leaf every year and just hang on to life until an opportunity comes around again to really flourish. So opportunistic plants is what I'm talking about here. These are species that can quickly respond when space opens up within the competition in a plant community. So daisy fleabane is a picture here that I'm showing. A lot of these, and this is an example, this is snow on the mountain. A lot of these are plants that cattle don't like, and other livestock species don't normally like, which gives them an additional advantage, right? If you're looking at a site that's being grazed really hard, and if you're a plant that the cows don't like, or sheep or whoever doesn't like, and everybody around you is getting grazed, that's an additional advantage. And then again, a lot of times these are species that are going to fade away pretty quickly once those perennial vegetation, especially grasses, get a chance to sort of re-engage and build their energy and competition back up again. So this is a longer list of some of those species. Ragweeds, both perennial and annual ragweeds, fit into this category: ironweed, hoary vervain. I put an asterisk on 3 of these species because mullein is an opportunistic plant in the eastern 2/3 of the state. Out in the western part of the state, it seems to be acting differently in the last 5 years or so, maybe 10 years. And so we're still trying to figure out what that looks like. But in the areas that I mostly manage, which would be the Central Platte River, north central sandhills, and eastern Nebraska, mullein is a species that is like a dandelion, where it shows up after a grazing event or something has sort of reduced competition. It puts out some leaves the first year, the next year it blooms, makes seed, and then it dies. And as long as the grass is sort of recovering by the time it puts out seed, those seeds lay on the ground and they don't germinate and keep that cycle going. Actually, musk thistle can be somewhat similar to that. If you manage sites in most places around the state, musk thistle is taking advantage of a situation, usually heavy grazing, to come in, or it shows up in places where around water tanks or on the edges of a fence line or around trees where cattle concentrate and sort of suppress the grasses. That's where musk thistle does best. And you can change your management and allow the grasses to get really strong in those areas. That'll get rid of most of those musk thistles in many sites. And then the other one I have an asterisk on is the annual brooms, because things like cheatgrass are a lot less competitive as you go east in the state. So in the Panhandle, I would say cheatgrass is a true invasive species. It's a real problem in grazed areas, um, but it'll invade just about anywhere, regardless of what is happening from a grazing standpoint. Where further east is just not as good a competitor because we have a lot more moisture and it doesn't monopolize all those resources. Anyway, the point is, this is a list that shows a bunch of different opportunistic plants. There's a lot more than this, but these are just some examples. So, who cares? Um, what I want to try to convince you of is that these opportunistic plants, you could call them weeds if you want. Most of them are native species, not all of them. You can call them weeds, and I'm okay with that, but there is a lot of value to these species. So I'm going to give you a few examples. So one example is this picture that I showed earlier with all the wildflowers that responded after grazing. That's a bonanza for pollinators. So if you're managing for pollinators, that's something that looks really good for bees and butterflies and flies and beetles and all the other species that are good, important pollinators in the state. Um, and here's just a little bit of data that we collected years ago from my family prairie, but also from some other sites in the same study. And what I was going to point out to you is that the high bars, so the places where we had the most number of wildflowers, always happened the year after we did a season-long grazing event. So the way I manage this site, a pasture might get grazed really hard for most of a season, and then the following year gets a full year of rest or more. And so what you can see here is that those recovery years, there's a lot of wildflowers, and then the year before and the year after, there aren't very many. And the point of this is just to show how variable that can be from year to year. And in this case, most of those wildflowers are these short-lived sort of opportunistic plants. And again, this is also a photo from my family prairie. So not always is it going to be black-eyed Susans and hoary vervain and upright coneflower and these big showy things. Sometimes it's things like western ragweed, and you might think, well, that's definitely a species I don't care about. But I'll argue with you about that. Here's a photo from the winter in the snow, and you can see all those tracks converging in one place. That one place is where the ragweed plants are. So Western ragweed seeds are scattered all around there because that's an incredibly valuable seed source, food source for birds and other wildlife during the wintertime. Um, and if you go out in the snow and you really pay attention to where the tracks of birds and small mammals are heading, Western ragweed gets a lot of attention during the winter. I would also say that whether it's ragweed or wildflowers, that sort of short grass, lots of wildflowers, lots of forbs, broadleaf plants, is really good for insects. And so you get a whole bunch of insect biomass, which is incredible food for wildlife again, but it also does a lot of other things, which I'm going to talk about in terms of, well, the insects do a lot of things, whether that's pollinators or dung beetles or herbivores or parasitoids that control other insect populations. All of those things are good, whether you're a livestock producer or a hunter or just somebody who likes to go out and look at butterflies. Also, in those areas, you have a lot of sun that hits the ground, but there's also a lot of shade available. It's a really unique habitat type because the grasses, for the most part, are sort of suppressed, they're not growing really strong. It's not hard to walk around at the ground level. So if you're a quail chick or a pheasant chick, for example, it's real easy to move around. If you're a snake or a grasshopper and you need to get warm and then cool off and then warm again, it's real easy to move from sun to shade. And like I mentioned with brood rearing cover, for whether it's quail or upland sandpipers shown here, that upland sandpiper family was in my family prairie in a site that was full of western ragweed that particular year. Um, and that's where the mom had her chick because that was easy to run around in, lots of insects, but still plenty of cover to hide in. And quail, pheasants, grouse all do the same thing. I want to focus just for a moment on one particular group of opportunistic plants, which is the annual sunflowers that we have in Nebraska. We have two species of annual sunflowers in Nebraska, but we actually have 9 species of sunflowers overall. So 7 of those are long-lived perennial sunflowers, stiff sunflower, Maximilian sunflower. There's a whole list of them that can live for decades and decades at a time. But there are 2, garden sunflower, annual sunflower, which is the great big one with the heads, they're pretty good size. You see in cornfields in the eastern half of the state especially, but they're statewide. And then the plains sunflower is the annual that you see up in the sandhills of Nebraska or anywhere else where we have really sandy soil. but the two of them act very similarly. So I'm going to combine them together for this conversation. But sunflowers in general, all 9 species, have a lot of value for wildlife. There are bee species, for example, that are specialists on sunflowers. So they'll feed on any of those sunflowers, but they really need a sunflower to get the nutrition that they need for themselves and for the kids that they're raising. There are lots of insects, whether it's grasshoppers or moth larvae or beetles or lots of other things that feed on sunflowers, especially on the pollen and nectar of sunflowers. And because of that, you've got a lot of predators that hang around and feed on those insects that are coming, including both spiders and ants. And ants are actually on sunflowers for 2 reasons. They're there for the food, for the insects, but they're also there because they have a sweet tooth. And sunflowers are one of several different kinds of plants that produce what's called extrafloral nectar. What that means is they're producing nectar on the front of the plant, on the front of the flower, but they also produce nectar from these little pores all over their body, basically, where they just sort of exude this little droplet of sweet liquid. And ants really like that kind of thing. And so they'll crawl up and down sunflowers looking for that extrafloral nectar. And while they're there, it's sort of like the sunflowers buying protection against pests or herbivores that are going to eat the sunflower because the ants are predators. And so while they're moving around, they can help protect the plant. And then, of course, sunflower seeds are really nutritious, right? Humans like sunflower seeds. Wildlife likes sunflower seeds. This is a red-winged blackbird in the fall that's feeding on those sunflowers. Okay, so I'm going to circle back to sunflowers a few more times, but I just wanted to use those as an example. Now I'm going to set another example, which is I'm going to look at a site. So I'm going to talk about the Niobrara Valley Preserve, which is a Nature Conservancy property up on the north edge of the Sandhills. It's kind of, if you drew a line between Ainsworth and Johnstown, it's in that zone. Or Ainsworth and Valentine, sorry, it's north of Johnstown along the Niobrara River. If you floated the river, you floated right down along the banks of the Niobrara Valley Preserve. On the north side of the preserve, until about 13 years ago, there were a lot of ponderosa pines. This is what it looked like on those steep rocky slopes. And then in 2012, there was a great big wildfire in that area of the state that burned up a lot of the Niobrara Valley Preserve as well as a lot of other sites. So the Niobrara Valley Preserve is about 56,000 acres. I think 35,000 acres or so burned in the Fairfield Creek fire in 2012. This is what it looked like the day after the fire kind of finished up. And so it changed the landscape dramatically, right? Killed most of the ponderosa pine, most of the eastern red cedar trees, top killed a lot of the oak trees, and a lot of the sandhills burned as well. And so I want to talk about sort of what the plant community response to that fire event was. And really, the response was as much to the drought that led to the fire as it was to the fire. 2012, many of you will remember, was the worst single-year drought in recorded history in a lot of parts of the state. Really warm in the spring, stayed dry all summer. It was a really wild event. And so the drought helped with the fire, but the drought also had a huge impact on the plant community. Now, what was interesting is in the Sandhills, a couple weeks after the fire was done, even though it was a very dry year, the grassland community started to respond, and the grasses started popping out of the ground, and those hills greened up a little bit before fall. But in the woodlands, that didn't happen so much because mostly the areas under those pines and cedar trees didn't have a lot of light when the trees were there, which means there wasn't a strong plant community, which means when the winter came, there was not really anything covering that ground. And unsurprisingly, that led to some erosion issues that following spring, right? You get heavy rains on bare ground on a steep slope. This is what's going to happen. But if you look at this picture from May, you can see there's some green plants that are starting to come in. And this is what I want to talk about. Here's a different picture that just shows 2 photos or 3 photos, I guess, from the exact same place. This is a time-lapse camera that we actually set up to capture what happened here. So this is a photo from May 2013, so the first spring after that big drought and fire. Here's that same spot later in the summer, and you see there's a bunch of vegetation now that's starting to cover those slopes. And we were measuring erosion on these slopes, and it was pretty crazy how quickly that erosion stopped as soon as annual ragweed and foxtail and annual sunflowers started to appear on the scene. They were able to stabilize the soil. This doesn't look like there's a lot of coverage there, but there's enough coverage that it hit those raindrops that were coming didn't have nearly the same energy by the time they hit the ground and started running downstream that they did before. So it really stopped that erosion almost 100%. This is a photo from a year later, and you can see there's even more coverage of those mostly annual plants. And by the way, a lot of those annual plants are sunflowers, right? So all those things that we talked about earlier that sunflowers provide are now being provided in this area that's going through a lot of stress and a lot of change. But ecologically, there's still a lot of food and cover and things that are being provided by the sunflowers and all the other species here. And by the way, some of those other species include cannabis, marijuana, annual wild weedy marijuana is out there, mare's tail, foxtail, things that you would expect to see in a crop field, for example, as annual weeds. But they're covering these slopes, they're doing a job. And then this is 3 years after that last photo. And by that time, that community had pretty much shifted into a perennial dominated plant community, which is fairly stable. So a lot of perennial grasses, a lot of wildflowers, a lot of shrubs had sort of taken over those slopes. But the way was paved for that to happen by these annuals, these opportunistic plants that stepped in immediately as soon as they could after that fire and drought event and sort of covered the ground. So it's a really important service, is my point. Looking at the grasslands on that same site, this is what the sandhills look like in one of the bison pastures up there. So the preserve is about half of it is grazed by bison, about half of it is grazed by cattle. This happens to be one of the bison sites. This is what it looked like right after the fire. This is what it looked like a year later. Oh, my date's wrong. This should say August 13th, 2013. So this is a year after the fire. And the year after that drought ended. So 2013, we had decent moisture, enough that the grasses sort of came back, but they weren't strong enough to fill in everything. And so one of the species that took advantage of that, one of those opportunistic plants, were these annual sunflowers, the plains sunflowers, just covered the slopes across the sandhills generally. So outside the preserve, even the areas that didn't burn had a lot of sunflowers that year because of the drought, but the areas that burned had especially a lot of sunflowers. Here's just another photo of the same phenomenon, just to show you the scale. I mean, it was just wild. This was taken 2 years ago in that same bison pasture, just to show you the recovery that has happened. And there's plenty of grass, perennial grasses. That actually happened very quickly. I just don't have a lot of photos of that summer. But the recovery was very quick. It was very different, where the sunflowers sort of filled in some space, but the perennial plants were already there, as opposed to those slopes I showed you where the trees had been. So just to nail it down a little bit further, I want to show you some pictures from this camera. This is a picture, or a camera, that we set up after the wildfire fire was over. And we pointed this camera down so it would take a picture of an 8 by 10 foot area. And it took a picture every hour and every day for about 2 years after the fire. So 2013, 2014. And so again, this is what the sandhills look like. This is what the camera caught in mid-June of 2014. So this is 2 years after the fire. So I was wrong. 2014, we went through 2015. This is what it looked like in 2014. So 2 years after the fire, there have been bison grazing this site the whole time, but it is recovering. It's coming back from the drought, especially. It's recovering from the fire. You can see a lot of plants here. Here's what it looked like the following year. So same camera, same picture, just 1 year later, mid-June. And if you look at those two, they don't look that different from each other maybe, but there's a lot happening here. I want to show you what's happening. So I'm going to focus on two species. The first one is stiff sunflower, which is a perennial long-lived sunflower, right? So it's one of those that I mentioned that can live for decades and decades. It spreads underground by rhizomes, which are underground stems, and it becomes more abundant over time if you let it, if you graze it hard or gets stressed, sometimes it'll shrink in population. So I was able to look at this picture, and because I have a lot of time on my hands, I was able to find every little stiff sunflower plant out here and mark them. And I marked them with little dots, all right? And then I just put them on a blank background. So this is all the stiff sunflower plants in 2014. There were 127 of them that I found. Now I'm going to show you a picture from 2015 and you can see how the dots change, all right? So a year later, we went from 127 to 168. So we have an increase in the number of stiff sunflower plants as this plant community is coming out of that drought, grazing, burn cycle. I'm going to show it to you again. So here's 2014, 127, 2015, 168. Okay, so we have an increase in the number of stiff sunflower, perennial sunflowers. Now let's look at Western ragweed, which we talked about earlier. So Western ragweed has a reputation in the state for being a weed and kind of a problem plant, which is really undeserved because most of the time it doesn't compete well with perennial vegetation. And I want to show you and some evidence of that, right? So I did the same thing. I can circle all the Western ragweed plants in these photos. Here's in 2014, there were 218 Western ragweed plants. And in 2015, we went from 218 to 98. So in the same period of time where stiff sunflower went up quite a bit, Western ragweed cut its population in half, more than that. So one more time, here's 218 in 2014, and there were only 98 the following year. So this is a plant, even though it's a perennial plant that can live a long time, it has rhizomes that spreads underground just like stiff sunflower, it doesn't compete the same way. And so as the grasses thickened up and the community tightened and the competition got high, Western ragweed started to diminish because it's an opportunistic plant. So rather than being an invasive that takes over under any conditions, it's an opportunistic plant that only can do that when it has a chance. Okay, a few more examples. This is a site on the Platte River, one of our Platte River prairies that the Nature Conservancy manages. At this particular place, we manage in a way where part of the site every year is being intensively grazed for pretty much the whole year. And then it goes into a recovery period where it gets to rest and gain strength back again. And so this is this is a series of photos from one particular site on the ground. And what I've done is I've taken part of multiple photos and stitched them together. I'll show you what it looks like. But in August 2022, this is what the vegetation looked like. It had come out, it had been rested for a year or two. The grasses were tall, the wildflowers were tall, very tall, dense vegetation. The following year, it was in the middle of being grazed really hard. So it got grazed for all of 2023. And you can see this very short, pretty uniformly short. The cows ate pretty much everything that was out there. The following year in 2024 in August, this is what it looked like. So again, if you look at this, this is all one photo. I've sliced up 3 photos from 3 different years, stitched them all together so you can see kind of a time series in one image, right? This year, August 2025, I'm going to add the 4th photo to this, which will probably look very similar to 2022 because it rested all of 2024. It's going to rest all of 2025, and then it'll get grazed again. But what I want you to look at here is the difference between 2023 and 2024. A lot of the plants here, especially these tall ones in the foreground, that tall one in the foreground is Velvety Gara. It's a very tall biannual plant. So it germinated in 2023, put out some leaves just like mullein, and then it bloomed in 2024, produced seeds, and then died. So it's an opportunistic, very short-lived plant. There's a lot of other stuff going on there, but there's a really big difference between 2023 and 24, and most of what's tall in that year were these opportunistic plants that filled the gaps. Another example, just this is back to my family prairie again, shows 4 different pastures in various phases of the grazing that we do, where again, gets grazed hard for a full year, year and a half in this case, and then gets rested for about 2.5 years. So pasture A this is an August photo. Pasture A got grazed for the second half of the season. Pasture B has been grazed all season. And so you can see mostly the grass is all gone. You see a lot of Western ragweed starting to come in. Pasture D has had 1 year of rest since that. So it hasn't been grazed the year of the photo, but it was grazed just like B was the year before. And pasture C has had 2 years of rest. And you can see that there's a lot of big blue stem, a lot of dominant big grasses that have sort of filled back in. That's a community that is very strong of perennial grasses, and it's ready to be grazed again. And I'm not trying to advocate for the grazing system. I'm using the grazing system to explain what we're seeing here, right? So again, this is a photo that was taken from within that system the year after the intense grazing. And this, if you just saw it and you were a rancher, you might think that I'm a terrible land manager. But all my pastures don't look like this, right? Or they do, but only for a period of time, and then they recover and they look back to grasses. So none of the plants in this picture am I worried about. And I'm going to show you a few examples of those. So the Western ragweed we've already talked about. The thistle in the photo is a native thistle. It's a perennial thistle. This is Flodman's thistle in this case, but Flodman's thistle, wavy leaf thistle are perennials, tall thistles, and annual that are all native species. Really important wildlife plants, not a problem at all. Not worried about those. The sunflowers are perennial sunflowers. That's the stiff sunflower we talked about earlier. The real light colored plant is silverleaf scurf pea, just a nice native legume. So you don't see a lot of grasses out here, although you see some big blue stem in the foreground. The grasses are there, they're just sort of suppressed in height, which is allowing all this other messy, fun stuff to happen. Okay, now I want to circle back to the real invasives for a minute, especially because it's invasive species week, right? I'm supposed to be talking about these. So again, these are the species that we really are worried about. They don't go away when the grazing stops. They'll come in even if you're not grazing a site very hard. Some of these are woodland species like Japanese honeysuckle and European buckthorn can be really problematic in woody areas. Smooth brome, Kentucky bluegrass, reed canary grass, these are all species that are common in a lot of our pastures, and they can be a problem if they start to monopolize all the resources, but you can also work on them with management. I'll talk about that real quick here in a second. And I just want to talk real quick about invasive species strategies. So if you have a site, if this green area on the screen is your pasture or land, and you have an invasive plant that's invading, if you're in a situation where, like I'm showing you here, where you just have a few little patches of it, that's a great opportunity. It's a great chance for you to go out and basically eradicate that new invader before it has a chance to spread very far, right? So you can go out and dig them up, you can chop them down, you can spray them with an herbicide, but you can really target just those individual plants and you can take care of the problem before it gets worse. That's a great scenario to be in. It's even better, by the way, if you can be in this scenario where that invasive plant is just outside your property, but you know it's there and you're watching for it to start coming in. If you can talk to your neighbor about getting rid of it on their property, that's even better. But if not, you just wait for it to come in and you sort of take it out as it comes in. And you're still in a good spot. You can eradicate it and keep your site clean. But you might be in a situation like this where that plant has already started to move in. Your strategy at this point really should be to make sure that you work on those satellite infestations, the ones that are spreading quickly. So you want to focus on these ones that have sort of moving further into your site. Before you do anything with the main population there, get rid of those ones that are really starting to spread because you want to keep everything clean. That's your top priority. So if you can eliminate those, then you can start working on that rest of that population and start to push it back toward the corner in this case and move that direction, eliminate them as you go. A lot of times people make the mistake of focusing all their energy on the biggest patch first, and you let everything sort of squirt out away from you, and you end up losing the whole battle because now you've got small populations that are sprouting up everywhere behind you while you're focused on this big patch. It's really important to take care of all the little ones first and then hit that main patch. And if you can mow the big patch or something just to keep it from producing more seed, that's great. But it's really the new populations that matter the most. And maybe you're in a situation like this where the invader is already there. It's pretty ubiquitous throughout the site. It's everywhere you look. Now you're not in an eradication phase anymore because it's probably not possible for you to get rid of this. Even if you went out and sprayed an herbicide across your whole site, this plant, these invasive plants, once they've spread this far, they're really well embedded. If you kill the plants, they're going to come back from the seed bank, or they'll have another way of responding. It's not going to be good. So your best case, unless it's a noxious weed where you're legally required to take care of it, your best case here is really to sort of just manage the problem, right? And so an example of this would be something like smooth brome or Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, reed canary grass, some of these invasive grasses that, I mean, they can be pretty good livestock forage really. And so you can take advantage of that and graze in a way that just doesn't let them become always dominant. And so an example of that can be with those grasses, all those grasses I just mentioned are early season growers. So they're cool season grass. They grow in the springtime. And so by putting cattle into a pasture earlier than you might otherwise do it, put them in late April instead of late May, you can take advantage of the forage that's available, but you also make sure those grasses are getting grazed back so they're not able to kind of keep spreading and becoming dominant and knocking everything else out of that prairie or that pasture. I want to show you an example real quick, just a little bit more data. I promise I won't have a whole lot more data. But this is a site that we planted to prairie back in 1995. It was a very diverse seed mix, 150 different plants, which is not what most people are going to do, but that was the objective here. And what you can see that over time, Kentucky bluegrass has become more and more abundant in this planted prairie. But that prairie has been managed with the kind of grazing I've been talking about, where it gets periodic, very intense grazing, gets long rest periods back and forth. We've been doing this since about 2002. And during that time, even though Kentucky bluegrass has become more abundant, it really hasn't become dominant. And I know that because I can look at the species richness, the number of plant species in the rest of the site, and I can graph that over time, and that hasn't changed. So we've had very, very stable diversity of the plant community, even though bluegrass is more abundant than it used to be. So what I'm reading from that is bluegrass has expanded, but we've been able to manage its competitiveness. So even though it's everywhere, it's not really causing that much of a problem. And that's sort of the approach that's going to be best in a lot of those cases where you have an invasive plant that's sort of taken over a whole area or has spread across a whole area. Okay, so if you have small patches, you can try to prevent them from spreading and take care of the ones you have. If you've got one patch that's starting to spread, hopefully you can contain it and maybe squeeze it backwards. If it's everywhere, then you're really just talking about suppression, not eradication. What about opportunistic plants? What's the strategy there? I would argue the best strategy is just be happy about them. Let them do their job. They're there doing something that's valuable. It doesn't cost you anything to do that. If you go out and try to spray them, a lot of times, if you have a pasture, for example, that you get a big flush of mare's tail or ragweed or something like that, if you go out and spray that opportunistic plant, what you're doing is you're taking out a space filler, which opens up space, which is going to be filled by a different opportunistic plant, or maybe the same one again. So you're not really gaining anything if it's just opportunistic plants that you're trying to get rid of. So just let them be, right? And if you want, if you don't like them being there, you can manage the way or change the way you're managing the site, reduce the grazing, move the cows out for a while. If it's a flood or something or a drought, there's not a lot you can do, but you can wait. And as soon as that rain comes back or the flooding goes away, the site will start to recover and the opportunistic plants will fade away. So I would encourage you not to do the third one, which is to just go out and blast them with herbicide or something. That's really expensive. It's not going to gain you anything because these are annuals or biennials, most of them anyway. So you're spending a lot of money for no real gain. So just to wrap up, um, you've probably heard this phrase, right? So weeds are just plants that are out of place. That's fine. I would say opportunistic plants are weeds that are in the right place because they're doing the job that we need them to do, whether it's controlling erosion or just filling space, giving cows something to eat, giving wildlife something during a time when that plant community around them is pretty stressed. So that's all I've got. If you have questions, you're welcome to email me, and I can try to answer your questions. Shannon mentioned my blog earlier, prairieecologist.com, where I write about a lot of stuff like this, but also just talk about prairies and wildlife and other things too. So with that, we can take questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was super interesting. If you have questions, please feel free to type it in the Q&A and we will answer them as you put them in. And I'll just give you a few minutes to type them out.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, I'll mention that if you're interested, the Nature Conservancy has a couple of different field days this summer that are just open to the public. We're still developing the schedules for them, so if you're interested, just shoot me an email and I can give you the updated agenda. But one will be on July 12th, and that's at the Platte River Prairies, which is south of Wood River, so that's July 12th. And then the other one is August 2nd, which is up at our Niobrara Valley Preserve, that site that I talked about. So the one at Niobrara Valley Preserve will have tours to go up and see the bison herds. You get to drive out in a pasture and be in a 10,000 acre pasture with, 800 bison. And then walk around and learn about plant identification at both sites. So if that's something you're interested in, shoot me an email and I can give you the details on it when we get them. And if there aren't any questions, I can make up questions.
I do have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Shannon.
Well, I guess my question is kind of, do you ever use herbicide or do you mostly stick with grazing? Or
Yeah, good
what's the
question.
situation where you would use herbicide besides noxious weed situations?
Sure. No, we use herbicides all the time as land managers. Every opportunity we get, we're very targeted, right? We're either using very selective herbicides that, leave a lot of plants unaffected, but most of the time we're using very spot application, right? So we're spraying the plant we want to get rid of. We're not just spraying a big area where there's a few of those plants scattered around. So I would say examples have been Canada thistle is a species that we've used herbicide on, purple loosestrife for sure, Phragmites. There's a bunch of things like that. Well, Siberian elms. I mentioned Siberian elms. That's an easy one, right? Because if you mow off Siberian elm or just cut it down, it grows back. So we don't want that to happen. So we cut it off, paint the stem with a little bit of herbicide. That takes care of the regrowth and makes sure it stays dead. So no, we definitely use a lot of chemicals. But again, trying to be very specific so that we don't knock out. But the mistakes people can make with chemicals or herbicides is that you end up knocking out the competition that's helping to suppress the thing that you're trying to suppress, right? So the more plant diversity you have, the healthier that plant community is, the slower the invasion is going to be. So you want to make sure you just kill the plants that you're trying to kill. But yeah, thank you for asking that.
Thank you for answering. And we do have 3 questions that have rolled in.
Okay.
So the first one is, I never really see garlic mustard in a grazed woodland. Is that something cows eat and help control?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. Um, yeah, I would just be guessing. I've never heard of cattle eating garlic mustard, but it wouldn't shock me if they did. The thing that I know about garlic mustard, the experience that I've heard people talk about, because I dealt with it for a few years, and then we ended up getting rid of the site where we had the problem, and so now I don't have to manage it anymore. Um, what I've heard is that the main thing is it doesn't like light. So the more light you can let into the woodland, the less competitive garlic mustard is. And so a lot of people use fire, for example, on natural areas where they burn fairly frequently, which keeps the trees there. It allows the main big trees to stay, but it gets rid of a lot of the understory trees and brush. And that lets more light hit the ground, and that makes garlic mustard much less competitive and then just sort of becomes part of the system. But I wonder if grazing might do the same sort of thing. It depends on how grazed or how heavily grazed it is, right? It might also allow more light to hit the ground, which is going to work against the garlic mustard. But that's a really good question that I haven't really thought about before.
And this one more of a comment, which is, can you provide the dates and locations again for your plant ID workshops?
Yeah, for sure. And these are, we do plant ID workshops and we do these public field days. So on the July 12th and August 2nd, July 12th, August 2nd. Those are the public field days. If you're interested in like more of the plant ID habitat workshops that are targeted at land managers, farmers, ranchers, that kind of people that work with farmers, ranchers, shoot me an email. I can give you those dates because there's several of those.
Thank you. And then one more question so far, which is, are all thistles invasive hyphen musk?
No, that's a great question. So we have, Todd can correct me if I'm wrong here. We have 10 thistle species in the state. Half of them are native, half of them are not native. Um, all the native ones are good. So tall thistle, wavy leaf, flodman's thistle, plat thistle. Those are the ones that are common around me. Those are all great. They're great for wildlife. They don't spread crazily. They're opportunistic, not invasive. Um, the non-native ones, it depends on where you're at. Musk thistle and Canada thistle, like in our area again, like we have to control those because the noxious weed law says we have to control them. We probably would anyway. Um, but bull thistle, for example, bull thistle in a lot of Nebraska doesn't act invasively. Um, so it's non-native, and in parts of the country, it can be problematic. In Nebraska, we just haven't ever struggled with it that much. So most of the time, we just sort of ignore bull thistle. But it depends on your situation with that one. But I would say all the native thistles, which by the way, you can identify native thistles usually by looking at the bottom of the leaf. All right, you flip that leaf. If it's really bright white, that's probably a native thistle. You can just leave those alone. Musk thistle and Canada thistle, for example, you gotta control those. But it's worth learning them.
Yes, there are some great guides from the Nebraska Department of Agriculture on how to identify different thistles, which I think
Yeah.
is available on their website. And I actually had one more question, and we'll see if any others roll in, which is,
Sure.
have you experimented at all with your land in seeing any sort of invasive take over and just letting it, just kind of seeing what happens? And if so, is there like a
Yeah.
threshold where you kind of will stop, where you're like, okay, I need to take care of this?
Um, I think the answer is no. We haven't intentionally let any invaders just kind of run amok. It has happened other places, right? And there's a good example down in Kansas in the Flint Hills with Konza Prairie, which is actually it's actually a Nature Conservancy site that's managed by Kansas State University, and they set up a research project that split the site into a bunch of pieces, and then they had some that they burned fairly regularly, and some of that they just never burned or burned every 20 years or something, which is basically the same thing as never. Um, and the sites that they only burned every 20 years just they got completely invaded by trees, a lot of native trees and shrubs, dogwood, sumac, things like that. Um, but after that 20-year period, a lot of those they took and they sort of reversed it and they started burning them to try to get the trees out. And what happened was they couldn't. So they burned annually and it made all the trees short because they knocked them back to the ground and they just regrew every year from the ground. But after on some of those sites, they've been burning them annually now for 23 years. And the density of those stems coming out of the ground hasn't really changed. So all they can do is keep them short. They can't get rid of it, which is a really good warning for the rest of us, especially with deciduous trees and shrubs, which is once they get there, it's really hard to get rid of them. So that's an experiment that they did, but I don't know that I would feel good uh, doing an experiment where I just let an invader go. We've got plenty of accidental examples, right, where things just sort of happened and we had to respond to it, but we didn't do it on purpose.
Great. No, that's a very good point. Well, I think that is all our questions. And if
Right?
anyone has any more, you can type it in the chat. But Chris, thank you so much. That was super valuable. I learned a lot. And for those of you who are interested in improving your plant ID, I really recommend going to Chris's workshops. They were super helpful. And his
Yeah.
email is also listed here if you have any outstanding questions. You can also email me at invasives@unl.edu and I can pass those along.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us for our first webinar of Nebraska Invasive Species Awareness Week. We are going to have another tomorrow, which will be with Jenna on zebra mussels. It'll be at the same time, 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Central. And if you go to the calendar on Outdoor Nebraska, which I'm actually going to put the link in the chat, that is where you can see all our webinars as well as our event that will be on Saturday. So thank you all so much for joining us and have a great rest of your day. And I don't know if it's happy, but happy invasive Nebraska Invasive Species Awareness Week. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.